Hello, this is this is Jason. Um, so yeah, I guess I've got a few of you on here, four of you. Well, four is not few, but yeah. So this is a little less organized than normal. Usually I pre-record these things and then I can kind of clean them up a little bit, and then I also can participate in the chat a little bit better. But basically, I just grabbed some clips. So this morning, welcome. Thank you guys for joining me. This morning I watched this talk. It was the New America, which is formerly New America Foundation, posted this talk, and I just thought it was interesting. So I'm always watching talks, trying to learn more about this digital transformation that's occurring, and there were just some things that were said in this that I thought were worth sharing and discussing. So yeah, so this, let me cut this out here. So this is a talk with Fadi Shahadi, who was he used to be the CEO of ICANN. And ICANN is, if I can bring it up here, is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So basically when you type in a URL, they're the ones that kind of direct the traffic that send you to the right place. Basically, they're a directory for the internet, but they're central. Like pretty much everything on the web goes through them in terms of pointing. Now, at least in the West, it might be a little different. I'm not sure if like China or other countries have a different thing, but this is a pretty central piece of the internet. But and he's being interviewed by Anne Marie Slaughter, who's with the New America Foundation, and she was under the Obama administration, Department of State, and she was the director of policy planning. So she worked directly under Hillary Clinton, but now she's with the New America Foundation, and we've talked a lot about New America Foundation, Allison and I. Tamika Tilleman, who we've talked a lot about, used to be with them. So anyways, I thought I would just show some clips from this, and yeah, it'll just be kind of willy-nilly. So bring this up here. So this talk was called "The Global Architecture for Digital Cooperation."
Digital cooperation is not only important, it's urgent. I'm sure you're all reading and seeing what's going on with artificial intelligence now. And last night I had dinner with the program director at ARPA, who ran the AI group in 1963. Jeez. 63, I was a year old. And I said, Steve, I mean, really, there was an AI group in ARPA, really already thinking how he says, yeah, I was the first head of the AI program office at ARPA. So there's an important moment now to understand that if we don't cooperate, as these technologies really are coming to a critical point of being embedded in the physical world. You know, IBM 15 years ago, Irving came up with the idea of a smart planet where, there is now physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure intertwined. But frankly, he was way ahead of his time. It is happening intertwined.
So I think he's talking about Irvin Laszlo. I'm not sure. I think that's Irvin Laszlo. But but that was interesting too. He says that going back to the 60s, there was a department looking at artificial intelligence with ARPA. So, I mean, we see these things come on the scene and we think that they're new. And, think about the fact that, was it 20? I don't have it up here, but the OpenAI was, the chat GPT, everything we're looking at, that was started in 2015, but this AI project goes way back. And we think of, the companies or these different individuals that are at the front of it. But there's this infrastructure that's behind there that's been around for a long time, that's connected to, largely connected to the military. So I thought that was interesting. Also, let me know how the sound is too. I always look at my little meters going up and down. It's not the most reliable way because sometimes I come back and the sound's like too low, and but it looked fine on my little meters. So if you guys have any issues with the sound, please let me know. So I'll continue on here.
But frankly, he was way ahead of his time. It is happening now. And we're seeing it, and that's why you're seeing scientists quit jobs and people not knowing what to do, because it's a critical moment. If we do not cooperate, and that means all people of goodwill in government, in business, especially in business, I put a line under that because I'm from that world. And then, of course, all of us as citizens, as users, if we don't cooperate to define what is civilization going to look like moving forward when the machines and humans will be a hybrid entity. So digital is no longer something separate. Your vision when you wrote about the world coming together, frankly, is now happening. It didn't happen before. We won't know very soon if we're talking about a human or a machine or a combo. Very soon, this is almost there. And I'm not terrified. I actually think there will be lots of good out of that. But we need cooperation and honest commitment, because the amount of money that is chasing the intertwining of digital and physical is so high. I mean, from 20 million a couple of years ago in that space to 20 billion this year, and probably 200 billion next year, the way the money is going. So when money goes after something, it becomes even more urgent that we cooperate and we make things transparent. Transparent is one of the key words and concepts we pushed in the UN Digital Cooperation Panel, because if things happen behind walls and behind doors, they can develop in ways that may not be good for all.
So this is, this stupid thing. I need to reset this. Okay. Yeah. So he talks about, we need cooperation, but businesses are crucial, that the businesses cooperate. And there was a lot of discussion about the government's on board, but we don't necessarily have all the businesses on board. Although actually, if you look at at least the world's largest multinational corporations, they all seem to be fairly on board, and I'm sure there's some kinks that they're ironing out. But that whole idea of cooperation is interesting, because like who are the players, and who are they use the word stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders that are at the table? And he says, we don't want these things behind closed doors, but this whole infrastructure up until now, a large part of it has actually been done behind closed doors. So it's kind of disingenuous. But some of the things they said, like in terms of like, we're not going to be able to tell humans and machines, and maybe a blending of both. These are ideas that in most people's minds still belong in science fiction. But if you look at who the people are at New America and who this guy is, these are not like just, some fringe people talking that are reading too many science fiction books. So I thought that was interesting.
So was the vision of that the panel came out with, was it a vision of nations cooperating on digital issues in digital space? I mean, because you could imagine a whole new United Nations, right? You had the United Nations of physical space, and you have the United Nations in digital space, but that's very broad. Was there a kind of anchoring vision?
So real quick, the discussion about the United Nations and cooperation, you have getting cooperation between heads of government and businesses. Well, the majority of people in the world aren't a part of that. And so they'll give lip service to different individual people having some sort of little token or whatever, token participation, which will ultimately be meaningless. I mean, you can put your 2 cents in, but they're really talking about cooperation amongst amongst the institutions that are already running the show. And even amongst that, like you look at all these governments, like the heads of governments, they all fall into, there's not a lot of range within their worldviews and within what actually it is that they're pursuing. Maybe they want a little bigger piece of the pie or whatever. But like, listen to this in terms of like understanding that governance as we know it is about to radically change. So I started out, looking at, the UN, like a lot of the people that I was hearing from when I was in high school were going on and on about the UN. It's the UN's taken over. And I realized that that's just like one little piece of a larger structure. And they're like, we need to, it's people that are looking at like nationality, like the patriotic thing of like America is being taken over or whatever. And what you realize is that there's been a process, and I realize like nation states aren't even, they still exist and they still serve a function in the global order, but not as much as people think they do. And increasingly in the coming years, it's going to be even less and less so as these digital governance systems come online. They are going to effectively replace what we've traditionally seen as governance, and they're not going to need traditional government as much in the near future, because you're going to be governed through your smartphone. Anyway, so yeah, my first like inkling of this actually came from looking at the global financial system and studying like the World Bank, the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, and all these international trade agreements, and realized that these contracts that were being made, these agreements, were actually sidestepping the traditional nation state that we as we know it. So, but now we have these new systems coming online that are even taking it a step above that. And that's not to say we need to go back and fight for America, because who's who? Who is us and who is them? People talk about the United States as us. Well, this government hasn't represented you since the beginning, really. I mean, in all honesty, unless you're, I'm reading your comments over here, unless you're, one of the elite people anyways. But the majority of the people, these people that he's talking about cooperating, don't actually represent, they are not the majority of the world's population, and they don't even represent the majority of the world's population. So when they talk about cooperation, they're not talking about everyone. And anyway.
Yes, the anchoring vision is anchored, frankly, in your concept of a networked model, meaning the reason it's worked to date in the digital space is because we never had a single authority. I think if we continue thinking of the governance of the digital world as a networked environment, just like the internet is. The internet is there. I mean, have any of you been able to say, where's the internet? Is there one network called the internet? In fact, the internet is today about 89,000 networks, specifically understood by people who know the digital infrastructure. But how does it look like one internet? Because the people who designed it as a highly networked distributed model, but that collaborated. Those 89,000 networks collaborate. They work together. They have common norms which are built into protocols. Now, imagine if we create a governance model that looks like the internet, that doesn't have a center.
So trying to wrap your mind around what this new system is going to look like. And a lot of people are like, one world government and all these narratives that have been thrown around are not an accurate portrayal of what's actually happening. It's going to be one system, one networked system, but there's going to be little digital fiefdoms and stuff within it. But they're all going to be connected by protocols. And so like understanding layers is really important. There are a lot of different layers to this. And so like even with like the Ethereum program, like there's the base layer and then there's a layer on top, like Polygon, or there's different layers on top of that, or even like our economic system. I would view like the banking system as one layer, the central banking system is one layer, and then the commercial banking system is another layer, and then beneath that you have like corporations who do what they do within their layer, and then down here you have like labor doing what they do in their layer, and all these things they're connected. And so yeah, what we're looking at is a layered system, but there are within that layered system hierarchies, and there are protocols that set the rules. And so yeah, I think that's a useful thing to think about.
At ICANN, I was responsible for something called the root of the internet.
So that would be kind of more of a base layer, the root layer.
Very few people know how the root works.
I've never heard of the root of the internet.
So the root of the internet is 13 systems, literally systems, 10 in the United States, 1 in Japan, 1 in the Netherlands, and 1 in Sweden.
Wow.
And those 13 systems are the root that determines where all the traffic goes. It has the core addresses that say, so in that root, for example, we put that if you type any address that ends with .org, it goes to a machine run by .org, or if it's IBM.com, or IBM.org, it will send it to them. That's all in the root. It's the most attacked system on the planet, because if it's down, the root of the internet will be down. Everything will still be there, but you won't find it. So I mentioned the root because the root itself is a model of networked governance. So who runs these 13? You could find out. You go online. Who runs the 13 root nodes of the internet? One of which is run by the University of Maryland, for example. One of which is run by USC. One of which is run by a small company you've never heard of in Holland. Now, when ICANN was responsible for the root, could I call these 13 people and say, please remove .Russia from the root, which would stop anybody finding any website in Russia? And by the way, there were pressure on ICANN in the last few months to do so. Russia is an aggressor. Remove them from the root. There was a huge pressure on ICANN to do that. And within ICANN, there was a multi-stakeholder dialogue, including governments and businesses and civil society users saying, should we remove Russia given their aggression? And the answer was, of course not. It's not our business to decide. Just like I decided when I was head of ICANN, when the Houthis were telling me, you need to give us .Yemen and the other, and I said, no, we don't do that. It's not our business to get involved in this. The internet maintained its stability because we have a very networked model. And even if ICANN told the root operators, remove Russia, they have a mechanism to consult amongst themselves and say, even though ICANN is the coordinator, we think they're being influenced. We're not going to do it. There is networked governance at every level of the digital infrastructure. And that's why it's working. Have you ever typed IBM.com and ended up at HP? Never. It's it never broke. Because it's stable, it's resilient, it's governed just like it looks like physically.
So, yeah, a lot of this talk is just about like the technical aspects of like the management. But I think it's important to understand that because it's kind of complicated to everybody wants to pin it down and say, oh, it's this or it's that or it's that. And there's multiple layers to the system. Now, actually, the ICANN, he talks about it later. I mean, they're really just kind of, they serve like an administrative function, and like they say it like we're basically a director, but they serve a core function. But that this discussion about Russia is interesting because we're always looking at like, oh, it's us versus them, it's the U.S. versus Russia or whatever. I kind of wonder if they want like a multipolar world, like they need a multipolar world. But at the end, again, at other layers, like for example, at the business layer, you see a whole nother functionality happening in terms of relationships between these nation states that are so supposedly at war. You have, I think I heard something the other day that like Russia was actually selling fuel to the Ukraine. I mean, just like crazy stuff. I know World War II, thinking about different layers within the thing, we think, oh, it's the U.S. versus, the Nazis or whatever in World War II. Well, you had at a different layer, you had these corporations that are operating above those layers. So, for example, the different IBM was one of the companies and other companies who were doing business with both sides, yet they were kind of they lived in a different layer. And so like this thing that's going on here, I don't know how to, I'm not always the best articulating. That's why I pre-record these things so I can cut out my tripping over my words. But anyway, but like, so the U.S. actually bombed the Opel factory in Nazi Germany because they were making military vehicles for the Nazis. And then after the war, Opel sued the United States government for the cost of their factory and won. And so the U.S. had to pay them for the cost of their factory. So our thoughts about like the world and how the world operates gets turned on its head when you learn these little facts. And again, you just realize like there were different layers. Like there were the Koch brothers made their, the Koch family made their fortune, doing business with Stalin, and they made a lot of their business. So again, like supposedly it was like, the USSR versus the US, but then there's these other layers where those rules don't apply. So I'm kind of belaboring the point, but my point is, with this digital space, it's like another layer where the rules that we think of about how the world operates don't apply. And it's going to be an entirely different governance system. Like they're literally, what they're talking about here is this new system of governance, so, people need to get out of their head this whole thing of, the US versus Russia or China or whatever, and start thinking about these other layers that sit on top of those things. So hopefully that's making sense. I'll try to read some more comments here, but anyway.
So one of my questions was to ask you to talk about the lessons from ICANN as the governance of the internet for governing the digital spaces more broadly. I mean, we're talking about digital governance, but I also want to ask you.
She says, in terms of governing the digital spaces, but those digital spaces are going to be increasingly governing us. So the role that government and actually roles that were never even, governance that was never even, we weren't even being governed in areas. There are a lot of areas where we're going to be governed in real time through the digital technology. So just thinking about digital governance is really important.
At the same time, Candace said yesterday that people in the Planetary Politics Initiative here is also about
Planetary Politics Initiative too. Like, listen to the language that they use.
Decentering traditional power. And you can talk about that simply in terms of a multi-aligned world, as the Indian External Secretary, the Secretary for External Affairs talks about it, in terms of.
And I'll stop. She said decentering traditional power, but it's not eliminating power. It's not eliminating the power structures. It's creating a new, like I would argue that the system they're building is actually the most authoritarian system, will be the most authoritarian system that's ever been created by humankind, and the most far-reaching. But it's going to be distributed and decentralized. But it's going to be the protocol that's, instead of laws that are on books, there are going to be protocols and contracts that you didn't necessarily like consciously physically sign, but you downloaded the app or whatever, and you're going to be increasingly forced into these contracts.
In terms of geopolitical shifts, you can talk about it in terms of the shift from nations to commercial and civic actors, but you're talking about something even more profound, that there is no center one can point to, and thus many, many stakeholders have a say. So I'd love to hear more about, and maybe also you can start about how the governance, how ICANN itself evolved from an American entity to a global entity, and what lessons you take from that.
Wow.
That was many questions.
Lots
rolled into one. You can pick and choose. I'll now follow up.
Look, I'll start, if you would excuse me, with just a minute to make sure we all understand the layers of governance and fragmentation. So I'll give you a very simplistic model of 4 layers that make the digital world we want to govern. There's the physical infrastructure, the networks, everything that moves the bits, right? There's thousands, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of these. Who governs this? Is it well governed? I'll answer you in a minute. Then on top of that, there's the logical infrastructure of the internet, which is essentially what I was responsible for at ICANN. That's what makes all the physical network bits look like one internet. So that includes IP numbers. It includes domain names and the root. It includes parameters that are used in every router in the world. All of that is called the logical infrastructure of the internet. Again, how well governed is that, and who governs it? The next layer, which we've lived in for the last 20 years, is the app layer. Now, the email is an app. The web is an app. All those apps live on top of that. Once again, who governs that, and how well governed it is? And then now, and this is new, I didn't have that layer until a year ago, there is this new layer called the machines. All the machines, all the algorithms, all the models living, which need to also be governed. And who governs that? Every day, there's 10 articles in every paper saying, we need a new agency, we need something, somebody's got to do something, because everybody's freaking out about this new set of machines becoming part of our... Now, so quickly, the bottom part is well-governed, ITU, lots of good institutions, protocols, IETF. Many people contribute to how this is well-governed. And frankly, except for this new thing coming out of Europe, they want to go back to, share, fair share, all of it. In general, this is pretty stable and well-governed. The next layer, the logical infrastructure, which I was involved in, is fairly well governed by probably one of the most progressive network governance models, frankly, to exist. And I spent time after ICANN at both Harvard Kennedy and Oxford Blavatnik talking about this because it's unique. And I'll touch on it in a minute. And then the next layer, which is the apps, is highly fragmented, much more so than the networks. The logical infrastructure, highly centralized. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee says if the internet looks like an hourglass, then the logical infrastructure is the neck, is the key middle. But then you go to the applications. That's why you can't use Google in China, or you can't do this. I mean, it's fragmented.
You can't buy Kindle books on your Samsung phone.
Yeah.
Something that drives me crazy.
So this is the app, and then of course you have the new machines layer, but let's not talk about this now. On ICANN is, I must tell you, we were just meeting Alejandro and I about this now.
Actually, I'm going to stop right there because like this concept of layers, and I keep saying it, but it's so important to understand. And I still haven't figured out exactly how this whole thing is going to actually play out in terms of the mechanics of it, because there are going to be these different layers, and they're going to be parallel. There's going to be hierarchical layers, but then there's going to be other parallel layers as well. And I don't know exactly how it's all going to play out, but the idea that there are bottlenecks, there are certain like pivot points, there's certain layers and certain parts where they actually exert an incredible amount of power and control over the system. And that's what, I'm still digging into, but that's what we need. That's where you need to really look for. And someone mentioned the film Network here, John here in the thing. Ned Beatty does a great monologue in the movie Network, and it is a really great. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a really great movie. But there's a scene where I forgot the actor's name, Albert Finney, goes in and to the CEO. I think Ned Beatty was the CEO of the big media company that he was working for, and he's like, you've meddled with the forces of nature, and talking about the corporate world and the CEOs and big business, and it's really big business. It's not nation states, it's big business, and that monologue is entirely true. Paddy Chayefsky wrote that film. It's a really great movie if you haven't seen it. But even within that, those CEOs and those corporations are only one layer. It's a very powerful layer, but I realized even above that there is like this banking layer, and then maybe there's even layers above that. So yeah, there are a lot of different layers and aspects to it, and that's why people get caught up. They get stuck because they find some little. Allison. I talked about Allison's thing about Namshubs and the elephant. People get caught on like studying one little piece of it, or maybe one layer of it, and not stepping out and saying, oh wait, there's actually all these other different layers and dynamics to this thing, and so I'm still trying to wrap my mind around this thing that's coming. But I wish more people would start paying attention, because like the entire global economic, political, governance systems are changing like in probably the most dramatic, radical way in all of human history, and no one's paying attention to it. Except for these groups. Like, I think this video has like 30 views. I mean, it just came out, but like, these conversations aren't happening, and all these people are listening to their heroes or whatever, their thought leaders, or the people that they watch online, and they're all telling these stories that are fully contained within, maybe they're accurate, but they're accurate within a very small like dynamic, a small like aspect of what's going on, and no one's actually looking at like the core thing of what's actually happening, which is cybernetic digital governance that's coming. So, okay.
I must tell you, we were just meeting, Alejandro and I, with many of the former board members, Esther Dyson and all the event we meet, because ICANN is about to choose a new CEO. If any of you are interested, it's the open application phase. I can warn you after I'm off the mic, but it's there. So they gathered us to.
So he said he didn't want to talk about that. I'm actually very curious about that. So like, here's something where you're like, oh wow, that's actually something that should be pursued.
CEO, if any of you are interested, it's the open application phase. I can warn you after I'm off the mic, but.
So that, there's something I can warn you after I'm off the mic, so here he talks about transparency, and we need to have these discussions, and he has this opportunity, theoretically, this opportunity to talk about it. But, even he's holding back something that he thinks, feels, or maybe knows about this open layer. That's Allison and I have talked a lot about, like the need for this thing to be open sourced. That's a whole nother conversation. I'll continue on.
It's there. So they gathered us to say, what kind of person can run this organization? And I listened to all my colleagues, and I will tell you honestly what was my contribution. I told them, make sure the person who comes to run ICANN, unlike me when I arrived, I came as a CEO. I know how to run an organization. And I came to find out that in a networked governance model that is truly bottom-up, because many people call themselves bottom-up, but in reality, they consult bottom-up, but the decision is made in closed rooms where only one type of stakeholders is allowed. That's not what ICANN is. ICANN carries the multi-stakeholder model from consultation to formulation to implementation to enforcement. It's very unusual. You will not find this elsewhere, because it was required given the transnational nature of what we're managing.
So ICANN is just, like I said, a technical. They deal with all the technical stuff, and in terms of like the layers, again, they're more of like their mandate or whatever is actually just to make this whole thing work. And there's some things that make total sense in terms of what he's talking about in terms of how that thing is actually managed. We just need to make sure the traffic keeps going. So they're one layer of the thing. So like they're not even like the biggest problem there. I mean, I don't even consider them a central to the core problem, but that idea of like the stakeholders and who's at the table, I think needs to be seriously thought about, especially with company organizations that have real decision making power that affect our lives. And when they talk about stakeholders at the table, they're not talking about you or I. And even if you are at the table, they've got so many ways to manage people's perception. And, even if you do get your token vote or whatever, it'll be trumped by other factors. So.
When I arrived, to be frank, I was the first person to run ICANN who kind of looks a little brown, who speaks many languages, who was from a different background. And I found out later they picked me because ICANN looked frankly, very US-centric. It was controlled by NTIA ultimately in its final decisions.
NTIA
being the US agency under the Commerce Department that was entrusted specifically with changes to the route. So if we change something in the route, it had to be blessed by them. They rarely changed our decisions, but they had a veto power on that. And when Angela Merkel and Dilma Rousseff, when I met with them and they figured out this is the case, they said, no, we can't have that. We need a more open, transparent model where others are participating in that final call. Right.
So when they say others are participating, they don't mean you or I. They just mean there are these other world leaders, and particularly like Angela Merkel or someone who actually has some real power. Leaving aside that maybe there'll be some African leaders that don't have a whole ton of power even at that table, but they're saying that we want to bring more people. When they say we want to bring more people or stakeholders into that, they're really talking about national leaders and other corporations, and they're not talking about us. And I was as I was listening to this, I was thinking about the Magna Carta. And so in 2015, King John of England was very unliked by particularly, I mean, they were always, the barons and the king were all unliked by the people, but particularly he was being abusive to the barons who were like the layer below him, and they all kind of got together and I think they even like locked him up, like they kind of forced him, they forced him to sign this Magna Carta, which is considered like the first human rights document, but it was actually just about the rights of the barons, like so they didn't have to be taxed so much, and they were like the governance layer, governing the people. They would, they were obviously abusive to, the regular people, but the whole thing was about, so what happened with the Magna Carta is it did spread the power out a little bit amongst, it balanced the power amongst the powerful, if that makes any sense. So I think about that when they talk about like, we want to expand this out. We want to bring more people to the table or whatever. But mostly it's just about the management of it. The actual design of it, I think, has already been decided behind closed doors, like a long time ago. And his point about like, they brought me in because I'm not like this white, this white guy. I didn't have the, I spoke many languages and I wasn't like your typical, just like this white American guy. I think that's important too, because obviously they're trying to bring more people of color and more women into the management of the system that they're setting up.
Right. So what I did at ICANN was take it from 95 people, mostly in Los Angeles, Washington, and Sydney, to 500 people in 36 countries. I internationalized the organization, I made it look like the world. And it was a great privilege to do that.
So made it look like the world. And so that's, I mean, a lot of this is about optics. They're moving away from just having like this whole thing run by like white men. And so the frustrating thing for me is, like most of my friends are kind of more on the liberal side, and they will celebrate like, yes, we need more women of color and we need more, diversity and all of this. And I'm saying, yes, but the system is you can't just put like a person of color in this position with a particular protocol and mandate that's profoundly unethical and expect something great to come out of it just because it's a woman or because it's a person of color or something. Like, you're missing the point. Like, I used to argue with people about like the military. I remember there was this whole hubbub about like, women in the military, and I'm like, yeah, but it's the military. Like, it's not a good organization. They're out there like murdering people and doing yes, I am live. Anyway, so yeah, it's kind of a manipulation in terms of this whole diversity angle.
And then the second thing I did, which Alejandro and others helped me make happen, was to convince the Obama administration, who signed off on our plan literally days before President Obama left office, to give up that singular control they had over the changes to the route. And this was important, symbolic, but important.
So I don't know why he says it was symbolic. That doesn't seem symbolic, that the U.S. gave up its veto power over changes to the route. But I think this is, again, by design. This wasn't like Obama decided to, Obama was told to, and that was because we're transitioning into a global governance system, but not the global governance system that I used to hear about on talk radio when I was in high school. It's not the UN, it's a conglomeration of banks and corporations and these tech companies. And so again, the governance, the biggest governance layer is not going to be in the form of like a traditional type government. It's going to be digital. It's going to be digital government, and it's going to be automated.
That we created a multi-stakeholder approach that put guardrails so that I don't remove Russia because I got a call from somebody saying, get Russia out of the route. I couldn't do that at ICANN. The only thing I could change is the brand of coffee in the cafeteria, pretty much. Everything else was everybody. And you would think this would slow everything down. You would, but it's okay. Sometimes it's good to slow decisions down. But everyone was at the table.
So yeah, later on, I don't know if I got the clip on here, but he talks about just the role of the CEO is moving, rather than being like the unitary decision maker, is moving into kind of just someone who coordinates.
At the IETF, the consensus decisions are made how, Alejandro? By humming.
Come on.
Yes.
Seriously?
Yeah, that's how all the protocols of the internet were agreed to. So
this is interesting.
Someone stands up, says, here's a new protocol to do X, Y, Z, and a room of 500 engineers, most of them in flip-flops and shorts. You ask them, guys, if you are supportive of this new protocol that could change the internet, please hum. And if the hum of the people for or against is higher, it stops. You got to go see this. I think you can find it also on YouTube. You can find some humming decisions being made about critical protocols to secure the internet.
Okay, so yeah, the IETF, I'm sorry. That is, let me bring this up. There we go. That's the Internet Engineering Task Force. It's founded in 1986, and they deal with standards, kind of like the the IEEE. There's different organizations that deal with just creating the standards for these things. So that's what they do. But I thought it was interesting how he was talking about how like they do their decision making with humming, which doesn't seem like a very how accurate that could be, just like how loud people are humming. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then in terms of there's probably a lot more to that. I bet Allison would have a lot to say about that idea of humming. Let's see.
I hear a number of things. I hear one, you had to expand it. Mm-hmm. You had to make it representative of the world, so you had to decolonize it effectively.
You did.
And there you'll hear a lot of that. So like from my background in activism, like decolonization was a big theme. You know, we need to decolonize everything. And on the surface, like, yeah, we don't want to colonize. Like, yeah, I support that. Let's decolonize. But like, I'm starting to realize that like all these different things, whether it's peace, protecting the environment, working on decolonization, creating equity and equality and diversity, are actually all steering us into this new digital governance system, which is bad. It's not good.
You had to ensure.
But I still support on the the base layer of that, like, yes, decolonization. But I would argue that this what we're dealing with is a new type of colonization. This is a digital colonization, and they want everybody in, like no one left behind.
That it was truly bottom up, I mean, or preserved, that as you expanded it, that it genuinely was bottom up. And critically, a great power had to agree, right? Because, and I remember this, and Trump.
And I don't doubt that particular organization had a lot more bottom up in terms of all the engineers who were in the room and getting a voice in that. This, they're talking a lot about like the layer of like a technical layer to the system, which is just one layer. It's not even the main governance layer. It's really just the technical layer of it. But there's a lot of things in this talk that I thought were worth sharing and thinking about.
Trump, of course, never would have agreed. Trump, I mean, I'm not sure.
No.
I'm not sure they would have ever even really fully understood that they weren't focused on those issues. But that's a key moment, right? Great power, I mean, just as a veteran of the wars to try to reform the Security Council, no matter how progressive the U.S., the French, the British are, you start talking about giving up a veto and the door slams in your face immediately. So.
But like, the U.S. is giving up a veto to this international body. And the U.S. has been giving up things to international bodies from a financial sense for a long time. And because there's a transition that's been happening since at least World War II, probably even before, to a more global system. And even before they had all the technology, they were thinking about these ideas in terms of creating kind of a global brain, a global computerized governance, cybernetic technocratic system of governance. But it's not going to look what people think it'll look like. It'll appear to be egalitarian, and there'll be lots of different stakeholders within that system. So
Could those things work if you looked at, I'm looking at AI and algorithms, and you just said there was an AI group back in the 60s. If you're thinking about, as this group is, global governance or even regional for AI and algorithms, can you imagine a similar kind of structure?
I can. You and I, as you recall, we wrote a piece 4 years ago now on co-governance, and we chose the term co-governance partly because multi-stakeholder versus multilateral has become a bit of a religious war. Unnecessarily, frankly, because, so even the Secretary General, in his wisdom, if he used multi-stakeholder, he'd be booted off his 17th floor. So he used network, multilateral. Everybody's trying to dance around the idea that we have to work together. It's essentially, so we tried a different term. We used co.
they're dancing around the idea, but they're actually still working towards this common goals. And that's really important to understand. There are these different stakeholders who are giving different stories and saying things in different ways, but they're all steering you towards the same kind of system. And the idea of governance too. I mean, I probably should do a show or, a whole video just about like the idea of governance and the problems with governance itself. Like at what point is governance needed, and at what point is it shouldn't even exist, like you're going to be governed in ways that you never even imagined, through just through this digital technology, things that shouldn't even be part of governance, so again, like thinking about what should fall in and what should not fall into governance in general. Like they want to govern the whole world. They want to micromanage and govern the whole world digitally through this technology in an automated sense, and they think it's actually going to make the world like this perfect harmonic, utopian world. I mean, at least some of the stakeholders. Some of the other stakeholders are just using it to grab power and control. Like I said, there's going to be rules that they're not actually going to have to go by the same rules as everyone else. But
governance as a more mild term that did not enter into these religious wars. But yes, there is a model. We need 1,000 ICANNs. That's what we need.
So yeah, 1,000 ICANNs. And again, ICANN isn't really the core of the problem. Again, they're just there to deal with the standards and make sure the thing runs, the things, they're a directory for where things go, but it's useful. Some of the things he's saying here is actually useful in understanding the bigger picture and other aspects of other layers to it.
Our world, as you said so well, Anne-Marie, is designed around a governance model that is top-down, run by governments, and the transnational life we live in now, and the machines that will be built before we blink moving forward, is a world that those institutions are, frankly, totally ill-equipped to govern.
Let's accept a distributed, networked in code for multi-stakeholder, very inclusive,
yes,
horizontal, bottom-up model.
It's not bottom up. It's kind of like the Magna Carta. It's going to give certain levels of rights and privileges to different stakeholders, but this is not a total egalitarian, distributed thing. The protocol layers themselves will be the ultimate governors, and yeah.
So let's say we're trying to create 1,000 ICANNs. My question immediately when I think about creating it, say for algorithms and AI for right now with all that money all over the place, I immediately think, well, it works for engineers, but would it work for venture capitalists, just as one example, or for simply corporate power, or for politicians, right? I mean, as somebody I ran a public policy school, and I was always very struck just by the difference between the personality types of the people who went into engineering versus the people who went into politics.
So in terms of stakeholders too, one of the things I was thinking about is like, who's at the table? Like some of these stakeholders that are at the table are bad actors. And I don't want to be at the table with them. I don't want a consensus. I don't want to be sitting at the table with them. And I don't want them to have anything to do with governing me or the things that are going to affect like life on this planet. But that's the whole thing, is like, we need to create a system that, all these people are at the table, but the people that are at the table with the most power that they need to appeal to, these venture capitalists and these politicians, are dirty, corrupt people. I'm sorry, but I mean, and again, it's not about the people because they're replaceable. Like it's a system in place, but nevertheless, they want to create the stakeholders where, like, a large percentage of the people at the table are bad actors, and so it'd be like on a plantation, and we need to create a system where the slavers and the slaves are at the table together, and we need to make sure that they're all their desires are satisfied. I mean, it's like that's not gonna play too well.
It's an excellent question, and I remind you a little bit of the structure of how the logical infrastructure is managed. There are multiple networks, just like Anne-Marie describes them in her book. They're networks. One network is responsible for IP numbers in Africa. One network is responsible for protocols in particular areas. All those networks are coordinated by ICANN.
Yep.
They're not run by ICANN, which, by the way, took me 2 years to understand. It's not simple because I thought I'm the CEO. I mean, I go tell them, why don't you do this? And they say, thank you for your input, but we'll gather the network. Then you needed a coordination layer on top of that. And that coordination layer includes all the stakeholders. So a bunch of experts may come together and decide, how do we declare what algorithms are doing? That's a network of experts who come together, come up with that. Then they propose something, and it's made available to all the potential implementers. And in general, in the ICANN world, they implement voluntarily.
And in all of this, there is no opting out. They're going to decide about this governance layer that's going to govern your life. And there are certain stakeholders at the table who are going to have way more power and influence over you. But even if you did have even if everybody just had one vote, is that a good system where, okay, it's been voted on, everybody gets to vote on these things. And if you know what, I don't want to actually live under that rule. I don't want to live under that governance rule. Well, that's not an option. You have no choice in that matter. Just like the whole data thing, like you own your own data. I'm like, I don't want to own my own data. Like I don't want data collected on me. Like where do I fit into this? So it's like, you're not going to have an option to do that. Oh, hi. We've got Allison with us too. So yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are said here that I thought were pretty interesting.
Okay. Now, if people go out of the norms that we all agreed on, which are not policies or laws, they're norms, then there is a coordinating group that can actually get in and really say, you're out of line. You can't do that.
So they say okay, yeah, you get a vote, but then if you step outside of that, we have a group here to make sure you get back in line. There's guardrails to the system, so you can bounce around, but there are guardrails to the system.
Coordinating group includes, when I arrived at ICANN, there were maybe 25 governments involved. When I left, I had convinced over 150 governments to be involved. They did get involved. Businesses got involved. Everybody was involved. And yes, it's hard when you take a minister from Singapore who's coming with a very clear understanding of what's right and what's wrong, and frankly, super well informed, and you put him next to an engineer who's saying, we can't decide it this way, we have to go this way. It was difficult. But we need to grow a new crop of policy experts who know how to coalesce these different people.
So yeah, they're trying to figure out how to get all of the politicians and business people together to create a system where people aren't going to raise too much hell about it. But that has nothing to do with the majority of people on the planet. I was trying to find. So he actually, I think he's the co-founder of this Ethos Capital, but it says engineer. I was looking at their website, Ethos Capital. They only have a couple. I was looking at their portfolio. They only have a couple things they're invested in right now. But I thought this imagery was interesting because it's showing this farming, the digitization of farming. But yeah, this is their. he's since he's left ICANN, he now has his investment company. It looks like right now the only things they have listed on their website for their investments are this New Forma, which is project information management software, and then this Identity Digital, which comes out of the ICANN stuff, which is they purchased Donuts Inc. and digital identity but not like you and me digital identity, but for like website. They managed 26 million domains they manage that are under their management. So
we should be thinking about a just digital transition the way we think about a green energy transition, that we will not survive, at least not as we have lived on this planet, unless we have a successful green energy transition and a just digital transition. And so that means we have to address digital poverty, inequality.
So they have a transition that they're talking about, and they're saying that needs to be just. But this transition they're talking about, it's already been mapped out. It's already been planned. There's nothing democratic about it. It has nothing to do with you as a stakeholder or anything like that. I mean, it's a rollout. This is all a rollout. And I would argue that it's not just at all. It's not environmental. But it's actually all about digital governance.
Final question there for you, and the flip of that is to build an enabling, just digital architecture. How would you tackle that question? Again, with this model of governance, when you put even governments at the table, not all governments, not remotely, are there equally. How do you enable, again, we were talking about the African Union's digital strategy. How do you enable the African voices, the Asian voices, the Latin American voices, the voices of the vast global majority to have enough weight to get us to a far more equal digital world?
Excellent question, and I fear that with AI, so remember I drew that hourglass where I said there are networks, and the networks are ubiquitous. Africa has great networks. I mean, most continents now have great networks. Then you have the logical infrastructure, which is most of us don't know about, but it's critical. It makes it all look like one. Then we had this app layer that allowed everybody to participate. Fragmented, yes, but open.
Open.
Fine, they don't want to do this in China, they don't want to do this, that's up to them. We don't like it, we will say it, but everyone could do what they want. I think we're getting into a new phase in that fourth layer where we're back a little bit to a highly concentrated thing. Why? Because running big LLMs, language models, will require massive computing power. Massive computing power. And that's why you see how the administration is moving in controlling some elements of that. Because those who will control the computing power will control that last layer more so than the people who do LLMs. And of course, sadly, Anne-Marie, the people who can afford to and may have the power to control that layer are kind of a couple of countries. I mean, it's the US and China. I mean, there's.
So I'll stop right there. That's the system as it is now, but that's not what they're moving toward, because they're really moving towards a more distributed, ubiquitous computing. It's going to be, that you get your app and all the different computers around the world are doing little pieces of the computation, so they can actually distribute the computation itself. I've got other talks where I've heard them talk about, like, we're going to be moving away from these like centralized cloud, systems, and it's going to be more like Filecoin. Like that Filecoin is a thing where they basically pay you in tokens in order to store information, but also compute information. So, your computer is no longer your computer. You're actually contributing to the global computer, the global network, so that that computing is actually going to be distributed. And then Allison said, I think if we imagine what may be behind this is biohybrid computer, the consensus decision-making process might be related to task-related social computations. And so that kind of ties in with what I'm saying is like there's through the tokenized economy, I think she's saying like more tokenized voting. If that's you can clarify that, Allison. But yeah, so it's the computation itself is it needs to be spread out. Just like I did a thing about AI, and they were like, we don't want to do this behind closed door. We want everybody to start using it now, and we can figure out what's going on. But they need that. They can't do it without that. It needs to be out there. And so the system that as is now that are bottleneck where there's a handful of countries and companies that are holding the whole thing. That's not going to work for what they want to build. They need it to be spread out all over the network. And Allison wrote wisdom of the crowd. Yeah. So yeah, it's, if you understand cybernetics, they're pulling this into, I don't know. I just lost my train of thought. I'll carry on.
Nobody else that will have the wherewithal to build the massive computer. Today it costs Google about almost 29 cents for every query on Bard. When you go and you put a query, it costs them about 29 cents. Electricity, machines, people.
29 cents per query?
Yes.
Staggering.
A Google search costs them 2.8 cents, so about a tenth. So that's a big issue. That's why these things, we still don't fully all understand what it takes to run these queries. And we're just at the beginning. We're asking it to write a speech, Wait.
Sonnet.
Yes. Yeah, wait till we ask it to do very complex things. The computing power will be what will concentrate this. So back to your question, how do we do this how do we make sure people around the world who will not have the resources to control the computing powers, how do they stay at the table? How do they feel they're still at the table? So that's
They're not going to be at the table, but they want to make people feel that they're at the table. That's for sure. They're going to definitely give people the illusion that they have some sort. Well, just like now with our electoral process, how many people still believe in this shit? Yeah, people are still getting ramped up for this next election. And if you study it long enough, you realize that it's, pretty much a dead end.
In my opinion, if the governance of those things moves to pure old school multilateral fora, then we kind of know that the US and China will be controlling those fora, not necessarily for everybody's benefit. But there is a war. This is the new frontier. There's no question about it. I think that the governance models we've been talking about, the ones, frankly, you inspired me to focus on, and ICANN has implemented, in so many successful ways, but also with some issues, but very successful ways. Those are the only models, bottom up, that stand a chance to include everybody in how those algorithms will be part of our life. How will the new hybrid world work? What is our place in it?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'll just keep going.
I understand the power of technology, and it's good. And I think it stands to bring a lot of good to a lot of people. So I also don't want us to take this thing and put it in a box, because all the voices right now is control it, stop it. I understand the fear, but this happened before, for the last century. Every time a new technology came, fear. We should calm the fears. And I'm frankly, one of the things I'm about to write about is the need urgently, Anne-Marie, and maybe you could help with that, for a pugwash moment. We need.
So yeah, Allison was just talking about the Pugwash conference around nuclear proliferation. So this is interesting. They're talking about a Pugwash conference around AI and this technology.
For those of you who don't remember, in 1957, Einstein, Oppenheimer, all these guys came together in Pugwash, Nova Scotia in Canada, and they spent a few weeks quietly, calmly in a private home. There's only 24 of them or something. Yeah. And frankly, they came up with a very beautiful framework that ended up years later becoming the Non-Proliferation Treaties framework, right? But it started with some wisdom and some humility and some stepping back. They had ethicists, they had philosophers, they have scientists, they have people of goodwill. I think we need a Pugwash moment now.
So, and I imagine that's probably coming.
At ICANN, as I said, we've never, ever excluded Russia, Yemen, South Yemen, whatever. We said, you have a seat at the table, but you don't get to decide top down. We have to build consensus. Once consensus is built, it bubbles up, and if it crosses some guardrails, the system is designed so it gets stopped along the way. But the decision is never made top down. If this goes to, with all respect to the Security Council, to environments where it's a top-down decision, where the consultation is multi-stakeholder, but the decision is top-down. And that's where the danger becomes. So yes, I think if people come from those places and they have agendas or not, or they have misunderstandings, that's the place for them to be at an expert table. And by the way, expert networks naturally weed out the non-experts. So if people come with political views at an expert network, it takes about an hour for everybody to tell them, thank you, Jose, very helpful, but we just need to get the work done. They're about the work.
And the experts too, in terms of a lot of these spaces, leaving aside the technical experts in terms of, I paused it on an interesting shot there. Leaving aside the technical experts, but the experts in terms of the governance or the ideologies that are behind a lot of this, they are in a bubble. They do have a worldview, and they're like, oh, that's nice, but you just, we know better. That's fine. So you'll get weeded out within those expert circles if you were to question any of this.
About the code, about the work, about the policy, about the protocol, and that's wonderful because it calms down the edges and it brings things together, and it's worked. It's worked. ICANN is not just engineers. It's engineers and politicians. And, France was lawyers. One of the most difficult countries to bring on board with
all the wonderful stakeholders
with the transition of ICANN. But at the end, the rest of the countries talked to France and said, look, we need to do this. This is important.
Consensus is not the same as unanimity. Mm-hmm. And that is actually written into UN documents, right? That we often think consensus, and then we think, oh my God, if you've ever tried that, you sit there till 3 a.m. because everybody, but it doesn't mean everybody agrees. It means enough people agree. Yeah. It's not majority. It's somewhere between a supermajority and unanimity. Yes. is consensus.
And she's saying a supermajority and unanimity amongst this certain class of people. But let's just say again, let's say they were to expand the decision making amongst the whole world gets to have their say. You get a token and you get one token, one vote, or they talk a little bit, I don't know if I include it, but they talk about quadratic voting where you get, you could have 10 tokens and you can put all your tokens on one thing or some tokens on one thing and another thing. But let's just even say that were to happen. The questions to be voted on were already put out on the table. And so again, what if you're no, I don't agree with any of this. I don't want you governing me. I don't want to live in this digital governance system that's making decisions for me in my life and the ecology, the earth itself. What's the limits of, even if it were, consensus based, what are the limits of that? And I think we should have that conversation. I think it's an important conversation to have.
technologies can make this easier, right? This is the work of the Radical Exchange Foundation, of what is now called the Plurality Research Network, looking at plural technologies, things like quadratic voting, that allow people, you take a vote, it doesn't necessarily govern, but you can find out what people really think, right? So quadratic voting allows you to express your preference. I can put my 10 votes on one thing rather than distributing it among 3 or 4 things. And that's very important, because we have to be able to find out what people think quickly and more effectively. And those plural technologies should go along with experimentation in governance forms.
So I'll stop right there. Like, another thing I think about too is just the whole history of like polling and getting public opinion, and then like, oh, okay, well, we did this poll and the public opinion says this, and then, you know, in theory they say we're gonna shape our policies based on what the public opinion, you know, is or does or says, and that's kind of what they're talking about here, is like, you know, in terms of consensus. You know, she said that, you know, your quadratic voting, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be governance itself. It'll just be get the temperature of how people think or feel about something, because you need to manufacture, you know, I think a lot of things that democracy as we think we know it is actually about manufacturing consent. And so a lot of these new systems are going to be about manufacturing consent for something that's already planned out. Oh yeah, Allison points out that Radical Exchange is Glenn Wiles' soul-bound tokens. They came up with this concept of a non-fungible token that is, I don't know if maybe there's some that could be fungible, but it's directly tied to an individual. So like basically it's a token that has your name on it.
I'm so glad someone brought this up. I gave a TED Talk a few years ago where I described the 3 legs of the stability, the stool that would give us a stable governance model. Governments, of course, businesses, and the third one being us. And then people were questioning me, but us, how do we put our voice in? And because frankly, to date, a lot of with all respect, some of you may belong to these groups, a lot of civil society groups also got controlled by businesses or by governments in some cases. Not all of them, but many have. I mean, very few people go to the IGF now because it's been seized almost by a few people, you know? So what you just described may be the solution to have our voices at the table. And our voices need to be an equal partner. 3 legs. We are the people. You know, we need to speak up with our preferences. And there are now technologies that enable that.
To make it easier.
I mean, there are even some people arguing that there are technologies to enable the coordination, that we could have 1,000 networks and they're coordinated by AI. I won't go there, but that could be possible too.
Very briefly, Alejandro Pisanti, National University of Mexico, former ICANN board member.
My former boss.
I was going to say, you were Fadi's boss.
Not actually, but...
Yes.
So very briefly, first, one clarification point that's very important, and I'm sure it was a pain for you, Fadi, every day, which is that the root is only the directory. It doesn't carry the traffic.
The root is only what?
A directory.
Directory.
It only tells your computer what other computer you're going to connect with. That's critically important, of course. But the traffic doesn't go through the root.
Yep.
The traffic goes through fibers, through switches, routers.
Got it.
Doesn't go through the root. And this is a very important misconception because people in governments and everywhere else believe that I can actually control the whole traffic of the internet. And that creates a huge pain for ICANN, by the way, because it's believed to have a function that it does not have. So it's only, and this is the question, how is it that the internet is
I'm going to pause that real quick too. He was talking about like people think that ICANN has a function in terms of the management of the root that it doesn't actually have. And again, thinking of this as a technical managerial layer to the system. I think the same way about politicians. Like I think people are thinking politicians have a power that they don't actually have. Again, like different layers, understanding where the power actually really lies and who has what power and, you know, what layer plays what role, you know?
the internet is touted, and it is really a decentralized network of networks, and it still has one central coordination point. It's the one point that makes sure that everything else can work in a decentralized way. This is an important misconception that has to be dispelled. It's only a very narrower function. It's a root of the domain name system. The GAC, the government participation here is very important, very interesting. I just learned that Peter was in the GAC for a while, in the Government Advisory Committee. At some point in 2002 or 3, we offered the government representatives in a reform process that we were making whether they would want to consider a design, a change in institutional design, where they would have seats at the board. We were even thinking of 5 seats for government representatives so that they would be 1 per region. And the reply, after some consideration, was twofold no. One was, we will never find a way for 150 governments to agree on 5 to represent us. And number 2 was, if we were on the board, we would carry the liabilities of any litigation. And governments cannot carry liabilities in this. The interesting thing about ICANN is that it's all built on private law, on contract law. The fact that if I register slaughter.com and you have a trademark that I'm infringing on, I have signed on the contract that I will relinquish it to you if you win an arbitration process. No, you don't have to go to litigation. So it's all built on private law. And this is a very, very important thing. So the governments are very powerful. They have an asymmetric power in ICANN. They have almost a veto power on decisions, but they are not governing the organization.
So I think that's important too there, that his discussion about contracts and how they're built into the system, and the contracts they're enforced by the government. Yeah, exactly. Allison says smart contracts next. I mean, that idea of contracts being automated, but like that's a layer that's built into the thing that, yes, the government enforces those contracts, but the contracts also kind of have a life of their own. And a power of their own as well. So it's a weird sort of thing when you start looking at. I've always been trying to where's the power lie? Like particularly looking at the relationship between banks and the government. Like it's a chicken and egg thing. The government gives the banks their charter. They give them permission to operate, which they need in order to operate. But the government needs the money that the government gives them the power to create in order to function. So there's all this discussion about the debt ceiling. It's because they need to borrow more money. It's crazy. Like the government actually has the power to create money, but they've set up this situation where the government has to borrow money in order to operate, just like a corporation would, or just like you would. So it's a weird chicken and the egg thing. The banks need the government, and the government needs the bank. But this is another thing where you're going to have these other layers, these digital layers that are going to have a power in and of themselves through the contracting process, and increasingly through smart contracts that are all going to be automated.
And just to make sure again you get that, the root doesn't have the traffic by design again to make everything distributed. So you need the root to find things, but it's not responsible. It doesn't control the traffic. That's the power of the internet. This is why it's so stable and resilient. And you understand its governance, but also its architecture is highly distributed.
Yeah, it's architecture.
Why was ICANN formed? Because VeriSign, then it was Network Solutions, feared that the government would actually regulate their pricing. So they accepted this very different process that brought in competition and yet allowed them to take part in the policy making. And we call this policy in this very strict sense, is the diminution of the space for arbitrary or discretionary decisions.
Okay, so that's it. I guess I cut that off. I didn't realize I cut that off so short. But anyway, so that's pretty much, I clipped it down. There's a little bit more to the talk. I actually showed you guys most of the talk because there was so much in there. Oh, he mentioned earlier this IGF internet. I don't know if I even included that, but he was talking about the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which is connected to the United Nations, and he was saying that that people don't even go to this anymore because there's a handful of people that control it. So that's what that was. But yeah. So anyway, so this is on the New America YouTube channel, and yeah, I thought there were some interesting things that were said there that were worth sharing and discussing. So I'm going to do more of these where, because I'm always watching stuff and I see little clips here and there, and I don't necessarily always have some sort of like well thought out thing about it, but I'm like, oh, this is important. Like we should pay attention to this. So I'm going to start doing more of these videos where I just share some clips that I come across that I find that are worth paying attention to. And yeah, thank you guys for joining me. I've got some more coming up later on this week about, this weekend, I guess. The week's almost over. My next one is going to be on lifelong learning. And again, it's clips from the ASU GSV conference that I've been doing. So that'll be the lifelong learning videos coming up with the next few days. So with that, I'll let you go. And I'd love to leave comments. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on these things, because some of the stuff, like I said, I'm not always like, I don't have some well thought out thing, but I just, like my ears there's certain things where my ears perk up, and there were a lot of things that were said in here that I think that are relevant, that are going to even be more relevant. So with that, thank you guys.